The suspect in the Boston bombing, by the way, is answering questions. Investigators are asking him if there was a terrorist cell, and did he and his brother have more bombs?
Patty's listed in serious but stable condition today, 1 week after 2 bombs exploded at the Boston Marathon. Heather Sells has the story.
19-year-old Jahar Tsarnaev is unable to speak because of a neck injury, but has been able to respond sporadically to questions in writing. Investigators are trying to learn what motivated him and his brother's alleged involvement in the Boston Marathon attack and whether they had any help.
I'm not convinced at all that they were planning more attacks. I mean, that's hearsay. I haven't got information about that, but, you know, we have to be vigilant.
But the city's police commissioner says a large store of weapons indicates they probably were planning more destruction.
They clearly had other explosives. They detonated those explosives at the scene of the arrest and shootout in Watertown. We feel that they had plans to use those explosives, possibly on soft targets.
Investigators are also trying to piece together whether the 2 brothers acted alone or as part of a larger sleeper cell. The investigation is prompting renewed concerns about the FBI's effectiveness in monitoring homegrown terrorists. In 2011, the FBI questioned Tamerlan Tsarnaev at the request of Russian security services, but closed the case. Now we're learning that the 26-year-old traveled overseas to Russia and Chechnya just last year.
Somehow he got off the radar screen and traveled overseas to one of the most dangerous parts of the world.
But the fact is, we've stopped 16 plots in New York because we know that al-Qaeda has shifted its tactics. It's not going to be attacking us from overseas. We've been able to prevent that. They are getting people in our country who are under the radar screen.
In Boston, many of the victims from last week's bombing are still recovering in the hospital. The city as a whole is also looking for ways to recover from a week that has left many shaken, confused, and angry.
Forgiveness does not mean that we do not realize the heinousness of the crime, but in our own hearts, when we are unable to forgive, we make ourselves a victim of our own hatred.
Bostonians are taking a collective minute to remember and reflect at 2:50 p.m. today. That's the exact moment 1 week ago when the first bomb went off. Heather Sells, CBN News.
Thanks, Heather. Folks, we have many so-called soft targets. The soft target is one where they're just civilians, where there's not a guard, where it's not defended. And of course, the parade route of a marathon is a soft target. What about these kids? But let's call it what it is. It was an op-ed piece by Mr. McCasey, who used to be head of the intelligence branch of our government. We don't call it jihad any longer. These guys, that Major Nadal screamed Allahu Akbar, you know, and then he started shooting, and we said it looked like a civilian rage or something. I mean, it's crazy. We've got to identify the fact that we've got enemies, and the enemies are Islamists, and they are being pushed to these extreme points by radical imams in mosques. Well, our CBN News terrorism analyst, Eric Stakelbeck, is with us today. Eric, you wrote a book called The Terrorist Next Door. Does this attack underscore what you had to say?
Pat, I think it does. Look, I warned about this in the book 2 years ago about a homegrown jihadists, American citizens. These brothers, Pat, were here for 10 years. You would think they were very well assimilated, good students, student athletes, but their Chechen Muslim background. Something was stirred, apparently, in this older brother. Where was he radicalized, Pat? Key question. Was there an imam, some kind of figure here in Boston? We know he did the trip overseas, back to Chechnya, back to Dagestan in southern Russia, which are al-Qaeda hotbeds. He was there for 6 months. Reportedly, he hooked up with some radical Islamic figures there, some terrorist figures there, and then came on back. Did he train over there? Was there bomb-making training over there? And the key question, why? Was the FBI not monitoring him any longer, Pat? In 2011, they interviewed him at the request of the Russian government. When a foreign government requests you watch this guy, you can't just let him go. A lot of unanswered questions here.
Eric, what is it you think they were trying to accomplish? Or did they accomplish what they were trying to set out to do?
I think they did partially, Pat. Look, they caused carnage at the Boston Marathon, killed 4 people actually, including the officer, injured 180 more. They accomplished the goal of terrorism, psychological, economic. Terror it shut down the city of Boston, Pat, a metro area of over 1 million people, right? These 2 guys, a 26-year-old and 19-year-old, were able to effectively shut down an entire metro area for the better part of a week. I would say mission accomplished. I hate to say it. They also dominated the news cycle, and also, look, with the explosives that were found after the one guy was killed, the other brought in, they had a lot more explosives on them, Pat. I think they had more planned. And another key point here, authorities also believe this cell may have been bigger. Up to 12 people may be involved in this cell. And something very overlooked, Pat, this weekend, there were more arrests in this case, connected to this case, on Friday and on Saturday in the Boston area. So we may not have heard the last of this cell.
What do you think about the action of the police work? It seems like they did an extraordinary job in getting these guys this fast. Am I right in that?
Absolutely, Pat. Look, our law enforcement, our intelligence agencies since 9/11, as Congressman King said in the package before, look, 16 plots in New York City alone broken up since 9/11. That is phenomenal police and intelligence work. And I can tell you, Pat, you and I have talked about it here in the club. Since 2009, there have literally been dozens of Islamic terror plots broken up involving U.S. citizens here on American soil. So we owe a big tip of the hat to our law enforcement, our intelligence agencies. But look, what happened in Boston, Pat, I hate to say it, it was bound to happen. We've had such a string of success in breaking up these plots and a good deal of luck. I'm not shocked, unfortunately, that one finally slipped through. And I still want answers about why this older brother, the ringleader in this plot, was not monitored further. Look, our intelligence agencies have done a good job, but the ball was dropped here. The ball was dropped in Fort Hood, Pat, where they were monitoring the Fort Hood shooter for months before that rampage. And also Anwar al-Awlaki, the al-Qaeda cleric involved in 9/11, he was being monitored, but he was allowed to leave the country. So not a perfect record, but a good record overall.
Michael Mukasey was saying in this op-ed piece that it looks like the FBI is dropping the ball, or else there's some civilian influence to downplay the Islamic roots of these things. They're all Islamic. Every one of them is Islamic. These aren't coming out of Irish separatists.
No, Pat, it's maddening. It's maddening. I hope the average American is furious about this, because our chattering classes, the media, the Obama administration, first of all, the president won't call it terrorism out of the gate. Second of all, our so-called mainstream media, they're trying their best, Pat, still to distance these attacks, this jihadi attack, from Islam. They're saying, I'm reading op-eds still, Pat, over the weekend saying, hey, we don't know these guys' motivations. Even though they are Chechen, a radical Islamic hotbed, even though they had al-Qaeda websites that they were surfing, their Facebook pages were saying Allahu Akbar, etc. The bombings had all the hallmarks of Middle Eastern terror bombings, but we don't know if Islam motivated them. Pat, their own mother, these 2 brothers, their own mother, said that the older brother, quote, loved Islam and became more religious over the past few years. I have to say, Pat, it seems the more someone loves their Islam and the more someone takes their Islam seriously, the more problems we have.
Eric, one last question. One judge said, well, you have distorted a great religion. Actually, these people were following exactly what the great religion told them to do, weren't they?
They were, Pat. Look, I think the radicals are the Muslims who are not committing jihad. If you read the Quran, you read the Hadiths, you read Islam's core texts, there are at least 40 verses in the Quran, Pat, calling on Muslims to wage jihad, holy war, against non-believers. What these 2 young men are doing, and what Islamic terrorists around the world are doing, are simply taking the teachings of Muhammad and the Quran literally. And if our government officials, our media, would actually read these core texts, they might discover that. I still don't think they'd admit it, though, and that's the sad part.
Well, let's hope they can read. Do you reckon the media can read? Eric, I appreciate that so much. Eric Stakelbeck, we're going to tell you the truth here, the way it is, ladies and gentlemen, but man, you get called some kind of a fanatic or bigot or something like that if you tell the truth. Sure, Islam is a religion, but at the same time, it is a system of world government. And we have to recognize the two go hand in hand. Muhammad wanted to take over. They had jihad to conquer people which they subjugated in order to establish their control. And that's what these people are doing, but it's horrible. If you've got a government and an FBI that refuses to acknowledge the problem. During the Second World War, we didn't have any problem saying Hitler was bad. No problem at all saying the Nazis were monsters. No problem. We were fighting the Nazis, and our job was to defeat the Nazis. And everybody in America was mobilized to defeat the Nazis. And then later on, the Japanese who'd come in, but primarily the Nazis. Now we're fighting a war, but we refuse to identify our enemy, even though it's in plain sight. Whew. Lee Webb has the rest of our top stories from the CBN newsroom, starting with an upgrade on the abortion doctor's trial in Philadelphia. Here's Lee.
Pat, the defense begins to make its case for Dr. Kermit Gosnell today, but it isn't clear yet if he will testify on his own behalf. The defense said there had been an incredible rush to judgment when it made its opening statement last month in this trial. Prosecutors called witnesses who described gruesome late-term abortions. 8 clinic employees, though, have already pleaded guilty to charges against them. 1 pleaded guilty to 2 counts of third-degree murder. Gosnell is charged with murdering a woman patient and 7 babies born alive. Rescuers and relief teams are rushing supplies to China after a deadly earthquake over the weekend. The 7.0 quake struck parts of rural Sichuan province Saturday morning, killing at least 188 people, injuring more than 11,000. It triggered landslides and cut off roads and disrupted phone and power connections in the remote and mountainous region. The Chinese Red Cross has deployed relief teams with food, water, medicine, and rescue equipment. Rescuers, though, are struggling to find survivors.
We are searching in a method called Dragnet. The method means we will search every village, every house, and will never give up trying to save the life of every resident.
The earthquake was among the deadliest China has experienced in 3 years. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel made it clear the U.S. believes Israel has the right to strike Iran to stop its nuclear program. Hagel is on his first visit to Israel as Pentagon chief. He held out hope for a non-military way to end the threat of a nuclear Iran, but he emphasized the U.S. and Israel see, quote, exactly the same threat, and that Israel may have to take action.
Israel is a sovereign nation. Every sovereign nation has a right to defend itself. That calculation has to be made by the sovereign nation. As to your question regarding any minor disagreements about timing, if a time should get to a point here where we will then have to develop other strategies or other options, and I don't think there's any daylight there, any gap.
Yeah, Pat, you heard Chuck Hagel there admit that the two countries may have slight differences on the timing of a potential strike.
Well, you know, Lee, this is what I've been saying for the longest kind of time, is that Israel is a sovereign nation. It's not an adjunct or a subsidiary of the United States or of the United Nations. It has an absolute right to pursue its own destiny and to defend itself. It's so nice to hear a Secretary of Defense saying that. That was a green light to Israel on the part of our highest defense official, that if they feel it's appropriate to bring a strike against Iran, that they have a green light to do it. I think that's a major, major statement. Lee?
The best way to achieve good health is to combine diet and exercise. A new study from Stanford University asked people to reduce their intake of animal fat to 10% per day. eat 5 to 9 servings of fruits and vegetables every day, and exercise at least 2.5 hours a week. In the past, some experts have encouraged people to make one change at a time, diet or exercise. But the lead researcher in this study said, for some people, that may be the best approach. But we found that you may get the most bang for your buck by making these changes together. Pat?
Oh, ride horses. Get a total gym. Do something.
You and your horse. I love how you think that everybody in America can go out in their backyard and get on a horse.
Everybody in every backyard. Can't you imagine the people in Manhattan? They've all got horses.
Sure.
Yeah.
What, about 100 years ago that was the case?
Hook up to their carriages and away they go. All right.
George Beverly Shea is being buried today in a private funeral service on the grounds of the Billy Graham Library in Charlotte, North Carolina. Shea died last week at the age of 104. The 94-year-old Graham attended Sunday's public funeral for his longtime friend and Crusade singer, but he did not speak. Instead, the third member of their Crusade team, Cliff Barrows, shown right there, gave the eulogy. Barrows said he and Graham spoke last week of how the two of them will not sound the same without George Beverly Shea, but they're confident they'll be joining him soon. CBN Hong Kong recently held its 5th annual walkathon. It raised more than $15,000 to support CBN's ministry to the Chinese people. Over the past 10 years, CBN has produced hundreds of testimonies of how God has changed the lives of Chinese people. The stories have been the core of the 700 Club Hong Kong. CBN also provides humanitarian relief to some of the poorest people in China and works closely with churches in Hong Kong. You can find out more about what CBN is doing around the world by logging on to cbn.com/international.